thank you very much for having me come and speak to you today. I really appreciate it. I'm here to talk about two things. The first thing I'm here to talk about is just development in general. The other thing that I'm here to talk about is the organization that I'm starting here in Egypt with the help of a number of my very good friends. Now, when I say development, a lot of people use the word development, and they use it for a lot of things. It's what's the Arabic word for development again? Gatawul, right? Like it's used in a lot of different ways about a lot of things. But there's a specific kind of development that I want to talk about, and that is, and also you hear sustainable development. Who's heard the term sustainable development before? Yeah? Yeah. What do you think of when you think sustainable development? What comes into your mind? Over the long term, right? So that's what I'm here to talk about, but not just development over the long term, because development over the long term isn't really that good unless you can maintain it, right? Unless you can keep it going. And the unfortunate reality is that gets more and more difficult to do every day. So the kind of development that I'm talking about is not just sustainable development, but it's also stable development. It's strong, stable, sustainable development that doesn't just kind of like collapse back in on itself and fall over again like it has so many times in the past, every time in the past. For every country, for every empire, for every anything. It's gotten to a point where it's just gotten too much and everything has just kind of fallen over. So that's the kind of development that I'm talking about. Now, what I was saying about the world in which we live in, the reality that we live in, is that it's more and more complicated all of the time. We all live in societies which have not just more information, but more information about more things, concentrated in more areas and more different ways, and also segmented amongst more different people every single day. So this gets really, really hard to deal with, right? And particularly in the case of a democratic society, it gets really, really hard to deal with. You've got more people with more information coming at them. They're dealing with this information in more different ways, and they're coming up with more ideas. And a lot of people look at that and they think it's just too much, right? But the reality is that the strength of our societies comes from this complexity. A lot of people look at it and they think, wow, it's just too difficult, it's just too hard. But in every single case throughout history, our survival depends on our complexity, not our uniformity. If you look at any civilization, any empire, any society throughout history, whether you're talking about like the Romans or the Arab Empire or like more recently America or something like that, any of these major powers, the time of their greatest success has been the time of their greatest difference. Right? The success of the Arab Empire, the greatest success of the Arab Empire came when there was information coming from all over the world, and people were like, there were philosophers and scientists and like all of these different people discussing all of these different things and coming up with new ideas, right? Discussing new things. So the first point I want to make is that complexity by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. In actual fact, it's not just not a bad thing. It's actually a survival mechanism. We can't survive without it. I mean, first of all, we can't get rid of it because the universe itself is becoming more and more complicated. But also, we need it, regardless of who we are, like technologically, scientifically, socially, culturally, politically. We need everyone to have differences in order to survive. And the simple reason for that is that if you just have one idea, one like political idea, or something like this, sure, it might be great, it might be a wonderful idea, it might be just a simple, amazing idea, it might be wonderful, right? But there's only going to be a certain number of things that it can deal with, inherently, because it came from a particular point in time to deal with certain things at a particular point in time. Like you take something like the US Constitution. I'm not from America, but I know a reasonable amount about it, and I mean, it's a great document. It's wonderful, but it's not perfect for it because the environment in the background is changing. the people in the society are changing. Everything about it, the universe, is changing. So in order to survive, you need to be changing. In order to survive, in order to deal with these things, you need to have the maximum amount of communication between the maximum number of possible differences. This is what helps us survive. Now, if I was to talk about this in a, that's my little picture there to illustrate it. I stole it off the internet, by the way. But if I was to put this in another, you see with these guys here, right? One person says triangle, the other person says square, and the guy in the middle's going, how can these triangles and squares be combined? I mean, that triangle, that's great by itself, and this square over here, well, that's fantastic by itself. But what's the new thing that can happen in the middle here? How can I join these things together to create something new? Now, whether we're talking about science, technology, culture, philosophy, politics, you know, everything, right? All of the technology, all of the ideas that we have, all of the societies that we have, all the economic systems that we have all come about as a result of this process. If I was to put it in a different context, that one, right? Imagine a bacteria colony. Imagine you've got like a big, maybe it's in a lab or something, you've got a big colony of bacteria. One of them, let's say this little guy in the middle, right? He's a little bit different. Now we're all different. All of them are slightly different, as you can see. There's no two bacteria that are exactly the same, just like there's no two people that are exactly the same. But this guy, you know, we all change. Sometimes the changes, they're not necessarily better or worse. Some of the ideas we get, they're not necessarily better or worse. But this guy has a little change, and it would work. You know, it would have a real benefit. There's only one problem. How does he get that benefit to everybody else? How does anybody else like really take advantage of it if there's no communication going on? In actual fact, there is communication going on between bacteria, just like there's communication going on between people. But the benefit of that development, maybe it's immunity to something else. Maybe it helps them survive a little bit longer. Now the result, the problem would be is that if we didn't have this ability to communicate, if we weren't all slightly different from one another, and we were to put this back in a human context, then what if one of these little bacteria who are changing come along and infect one of us? That infect all of us. Gone. We're dead. That's it. It's over. So the moment you start doing things, the moment you go, okay, this is perfect, like we have the perfect technology or the perfect political system or the perfect something or other, and we're just going to stay exactly like this. That's the moment you die. Well, it's not the moment you die, but that's stagnation, right? That's when everybody else starts to get more developed than you are, more advanced than you are, more everything else, because they're still all changing. There's still lots of differences. They're still bouncing these ideas around and creating new things. Now I want to put this in a different context. That's a map of the world, map of ancient civilizations from about 6,000 years ago, sorry, where are we? Yeah, about 6,000 years ago through to about 2,000 years ago, I think that's about what it is. In any case, what happened? If we go back in history about 6,000 years, right? Prior to about 6,000 years ago, how did we all communicate with each other? How was information communicated 6,000 years ago? Pardon? Letters? Even before letters. Before everything. It was mostly just speaking, right? It was like if I learned something, if I came up with a clever idea like how to make a fishing rod, or how to make a better axe, or how to use like a bone to cut something, or something like this, right? Then the way I would communicate this information is I would probably like tell my son a story, or something like this. Or we'd be sitting around a fire, and I would sing a song about it, or I would tell a story about it. And it would always be, you know, because I'm telling the story and I want to sound like really interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 300, but the story becomes like, oh, they're 10 feet tall, and you know, it all changes a little bit, right? It becomes a bit of a game where the piece of information changes and changes and changes, and it's never very reliable. It's very difficult to build anything on this kind of information, which is why it was very difficult for civilization to get going when information was only being communicated in this way. But then, actually, I think it was long before this. Actually, it was about 8,500 years ago in Iraq, what is now Iraq. People started farming, and then a few thousand years after that, in about 4000 BC, people in Iraq started scrawling things onto bits of concrete. Right? They started like scratching cuneiform, which is the first written language, into bits of concrete, and information literally became concrete. We could build upon it now, right? We'd started to solve some of these problems. And the two big problems are that whenever you've got information, it's limited by, firstly, the distance that it can travel. It can only travel a very short distance, so it's limited geographically. And the other thing is that it's limited in terms of the number of times you can replicate it. Like if I have a piece of information, even if it's on a stone tablet, right, and I want to create another one, I have to go, okay, copy this stone tablet to this stone tablet. So still, it's pretty limited. So what happens is that development stays all in the same area, right? So maybe somebody learns something. I mean, let's flip forward a little bit actually. Let's go. The next one, there we go. See, it's Egypt. And Egyptian civilization suddenly springs into life. People make a little bit of advances on it there. You know, they start writing things on paper, and it all gets a little bit more effective. And civilization really starts to grow. But there's still these two big obstacles in front of it. It can only be spread very slowly, and it can only be replicated very, very slowly. So even within this small area, only a small number of people actually have access to the information. If we were to go forward again, like to something like ancient Greece, right? And I'm Archimedes. All know who Archimedes is? Archimedes, yeah? There's a famous story about Archimedes. Let's say I'm Archimedes, and I'm sitting in my bathtub, and I put something in the bathtub, and I realize that the water goes up, and I go, whoa, eureka! And I jump out of my bathtub, and I run down the street, and yes, this is fantastic. And I write it down, and then what do I do with it? Maybe if I want to give it to my friend, I have to copy it from one to the other, and I give it to him, and he learns from it, and it kind of spreads like this. So again, still spreading within a really small area, and also only a very small number of people within this area actually have access to the information. So development is limited. Now what happens when information and development occurs like this, what happens when information travels like this, is that all throughout history, you have this power like, explodes, right, and goes, and they become what we call the hegemonic power, right, the most powerful country, because all of this stuff is being concentrated in one area. And then they go, fail a little bit, and then somebody else goes way like up, because they've been collecting all the benefits of that information, and very slowly, obviously, and then they go up for a little bit, and then they go down. And then somebody else goes way, and like they go down. And this is predominantly what's happened for most of human history, right? It's always been one, maybe two or three at a time, because information just can't reach that far. And of course, when everybody else turns and looks at them and goes, we don't like you very much, and lays into them, and the information is lost. And the only information that survives is the stuff that was communicated. When the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, we lost possibly the greatest resource, like intellectual resource in the history of the world, right? The only stuff that survived, the reason why a part of the world went into a dark age after that is because none of the information from the Library of Alexandria had made it over to them. It actually, funnily enough, required the Islamic Empire, hundreds of years later, to come and translate Plato and Socrates they translated it from Greek into Arabic, and then they were in Spain and they translated it from Arabic into Latin. And that was what caused France and Germany and England and stuff to go and have their little moment. Right? So this is is how development happens, this is how information travels, and it's a little bit unfortunate, really, that we should live in an environment like that. But I don't think we do anymore. I don't think the environment is the same anymore. I think that one thing that has changed dramatically over the last 20 years is that we now have the potential to not only replicate information infinitely, to create an infinite number of copies of it, but to distribute it instantly anywhere in the world. Right? We can send it anywhere, we can make as many copies of it, and what you've noticed that in all of these different areas, in technology and sciences and economics is another really good example actually. You've just had this skyrocketing development. It's just exploded again, but it hasn't exploded in one place. It's exploded everywhere all at once, right? Because now there is like, I've got another picture in here somewhere, but there is actually, if we talk even just with universities, there's actually cooperation now between all the universities in the world. If your university is doing research, it's not doing research by itself. It's doing it with 6 other universities in the world. So all of this information is being communicated, and we're reaping the benefits of that. I'd like to talk about something a little bit different. Let's pretend that we go back again, we go back a long time in the past, right? And what we have is, we always start out with a very simple understanding of a subject. So let's say a few thousand years in the past, we had this subject, and let's just call it philosophy. And it was basically everything, right? Everything we didn't understand just became philosophy. And then what happened is the environment was changing, and all sorts of other things were happening, and we had all these other impacts coming from outside, so other fields. So it wasn't just philosophy, it was all the social and cultural and other technological things that were going on over here coming in and affecting it. It was the environment affecting it, and all this sort of stuff, right? So we had a division. Philosophy became natural philosophy and philosophy. So they separated the stuff you can see from the stuff that you can't see. Right? Then a little bit later, after that separation, it got more and more complicated. So natural philosophy eventually became the sciences. And sciences became physics and chemistry and biology and etc. And then physics became waves and optics, mechanics, electrical science, blah blah blah. Atomic physics became quantum physics and so on and so on and so forth. And now you go to university and there's hundreds of subjects that you can take, right? It's not just you go to university like in ancient Greece. It was like going to study under Socrates. It was just one subject, right? And that subject was philosophy, and it was everything. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of little different things. But this has not resulted in the whole process slowing down. It's actually resulted in the whole process getting faster, right? Why? Because of this. So we have one subject. We have one subject. It divides into a couple of other subjects. Divides into more and more and more subjects. And then developments within these subjects all along the way have a ripple effect. We call it a ripple effect, like you drop some water in a pond and it spreads out like that, right? So it has a ripple effect. It connects with other developments in other areas. Again, we're talking socially, technologically, anything, right? Even in terms of your perspective, your ideas. And these create other ones, and they spread out and out and out and so on and so forth, and our societies become more complicated. That's the picture, by the way, of university cooperation. These are all the different networks of different universities all over the world researching the same thing. So, how do we address this? How do we take advantage of this? Well, I think what we need to do, something that we need to focus on in order to really create sustainable development. This is the first time in history where truly sustainable development is actually possible. Why? Because of what I was talking about before, about the way information travels. We can develop a stable, sustainable society. Not just slow growth, but exponential growth. And we do that by maximizing, by getting the absolute most that we can out of the ideas of every single person, out of the discoveries in every single subject. And we need to spread that information as far as we possibly can to reap the maximum possible benefit from it. Now sometimes the spread of this information, you might take information from over here and from over here, and it might be a really good thing. Sometimes it might be a bad thing. But when it's a bad thing, it means that there's a greater reaction to it. It still means more people know about the bad thing and they react to it. But most of the time it's a productive thing, right? So we spread this information out. We try and take information from over here and we ask ourselves, how does this information, how can it be used over here? How does this information affect that? How does my research affect him? How does my area of study, how can the research in my area of study be used to build something else, or can it be combined to create something else? Now I could take an example, like a very quick example. I'm told that I only have a minute left, so I'll stop in a second. Very quick example, take something like the iPod, right? Nobody set out 30 years ago to make an iPod. Or sorry, an iPhone, better example. Nobody set out 30 years ago to make an iPhone. Somebody over here was researching touchscreens. Somebody over here was researching software for security cameras in the United Kingdom to identify people's faces, right? Someone over here in Japan was looking at like processors, tinier nano-engineered processors. Somebody over here was doing this, somebody like this, and some clever person in the middle, namely Steve Jobs in this case, said, right, I can work out a way to bring these together to create something new. This is a synapse. A synapse is when there is connections made, not just technologically, not just socially, not just politically, not just culturally, not just anything else, right? It's across the entire board. In order for development to really succeed, it can't just progress in one area. You cannot just have technological development. It doesn't work like that, because if you have enormous technological capacity but nobody can use it, what good is it? If you have a fantastic education system but only 20% of the people get to use it, what good is it? If you have a wonderful discovery in like mathematics but nobody knows how to do mathematics and there's no spread of this information, what good is it? If you trace the origins of the internet back far enough, you'll find a mathematician sitting in an American military compound somewhere working on a project to link two computers together. And now we have the internet. So that is what I'm talking about. Now very quickly, Synapse as an organization is based on the idea that we can establish a completely democratic organization where the focus is to identify these ripple effects. How information affects other pieces of information. How can we use these ripple effects to create businesses, to create new organizations, to create new social projects, to create new research, to create anything, right? We want to identify all of these ripple effects. We want to look at the big picture. We want to see order in the chaos. And we want to use this to create a sustainable development. This picture, the last picture up here behind me, is an example of the software that we're using at the moment. In the early stages, eventually we want our own software, but this is an example of the software that we're using at the moment. And this is actually Synapse at the moment, right? You go onto it, anybody in the organization, there's no leader, there's no manager, there's no anything. If you can do some work, if you can contribute, you contribute. So somebody creates a task, people vote on it to see whether it needs doing. Somebody goes, I can do that. They put it over here into the in progress. Maybe they complete the task. It could be anything from send an email to make a video. They go, oh look, I've done the task. I'm gonna submit this now, and then once it's submitted, again, everybody votes on it. So the idea is that we can collect people from within and between universities, communities, and even in between countries to work on the same projects, all via the internet, and we can create businesses that truly take advantage of I think that actually might have been my phone ringing, I apologize. Oh, it's a way to finish up. So yeah, that's actually last picture, just to give you a taste of inspiration. That is an image of the human brain, synapses between brain cells. That one is an image generated of all the galaxies that we know of in the universe and how they link together, which I think is a pretty cool illustration of the whole thing. And that is the website.